What's up everybody, this is CleanGameReviews and today I will be reviewing Tom Clancy's The Division. First, let's start off with visuals, and with that, New York looks pretty good. I think that The Division was able to make New York look properly devastated after this virus attack. I think they did a good job of representing New York. I think there are significant landmarks that have been put in place to make it look like New York. You get this constant feel of New York. You kind of feel like you're in this jungle, but it's just a concrete jungle. It's really interesting. I really like it. I think it's probably the strongest aspect of the game is this visual design. It really does look like New York. It's an amazing looking game. It doesn't quite look as good as it did in E3. They clearly did downgrade the visuals, but it's still a great looking game, and I think this is probably its strongest point. Also, the way that the game is able to get the small little details, like when your character walks through the snow, you can see your footprints behind you. I think that's a nice touch, and I think that's something that many games would ignore, but in this game, it's really nice to be able to see footprints in the snow and be like, someone walked there, or look back and see your own footprints to see where you came from. I think it's a nice little touch. I think they do really well with the visuals in this game, at least when it comes to the environment. Though visually, one thing that they're weak at is the people. They look pretty bad in general, especially like the common citizens that just wander New York. Oftentimes they have a problem with looking very similar to one another. I was in the same room and literally two identical people were sitting in chairs in different parts of this room. They were identical not just in the way they looked, but also the clothes they wore. And this isn't just like a random thing of random generation. This is a room where I constantly go back to and I see two identical people constantly, and it's kind of just funny to see this. But the problem is it does kind of take you out of the realism of the game. You kind of get out of this idea of that you're actually in New York because you just see all these people and they look really generic. They look very similar to one another. The people just don't look that great in this game, but it's made up for by the visual environments, and that's why I think for visuals I'm going to give this a 4 out of 5. Next, let's move on to sound, and I think The Division was able to get the people in this game to sound good, and by that I mean they all sound different. They all have their own unique personalities that you can take from the way that they sound, the way they talk, what they talk about. I think The Division does a pretty good job of people building just by the fact that they're able to make these characters have their own little tones. The way that they talk, their talking pattern says a little bit about them. I think The Division does a pretty good job at that. One thing that they could have done a better job with, I still feel like the guns in this game sound pretty weak. I don't think that they sound very hard hitting. They don't sound like they pack a punch. I often feel like they sound a little bit popcorny, especially some of the assault rifles. They don't sound very good. They sound a little weak. They do sound decent overall. They sound better than, I would say, the average game, but compared to a game like Battlefield or like some shooters, they don't really stand up to that, and I feel like they could have definitely had some room for improvement with these guns. Probably the weakest sound design in this game is probably the music. It's pretty forgettable. I couldn't tell you a single beat. If I'd heard a Division song, I wouldn't be able to say that was from The Division. It's really forgettable. I can't even tell you like if in game they have the music or how often they show the music. I know during the title screen they definitely have music, but it's forgettable. I don't think the music in this game is that great. Overall, I think they do a decent job with the sound, especially when it comes to people, and because of that, I think sound in this game gets a 4 out of 5. Next, let's move on to gameplay. Now, this is a third-person shooter, and if I had to give a big complaint is they don't break the mold really at all when it comes to third-person shooters. It's very generic. The problems are that it's not very unique. I think that there's a lot of third-person shooters that break the box a little bit more. I feel like they played it really safe with the mechanics in this game. Also, one problem with the gameplay is that they portray a very realistic, gritty world, and yet everyone in this game takes such a large amount of bullets, it's ridiculous. There was times where I'm unloading an entire LMG clip into someone and they aren't dropping down, and it's just kind of disorienting to have an enemy take so many bullets and they're not dying, and they're just common enemies. These aren't even necessarily boss battles, they're just people that seem to take way more bullets than any person rightfully should, especially considering that these people are just wearing common everyday clothes like hoodies and stuff. They aren't portrayed very well in the fact that they take way more bullets than they should, and I think that it's honestly a weakness of the game. Speaking of boss battles, this game does boss battles horribly. They aren't that creative. They are literally just characters that you play against all the time. They're just everyday enemies with extra health, extra damage, and that's all they are. They don't look that different. They're very similar to just the normal troops that you are constantly fighting, so you never feel like a boss is that significant. I was beating bosses that had like story significance, but I couldn't even know that just by looking at them. They looked just like everyone else. I remember I killed the Pyro's boss, and I didn't even realize that I killed their leader until much later into the game when they mentioned it over the radio, because there was no like visual element that was like, this guy is the leader. They looked so much like everyone else. I think if the Division wanted to be a better game, they would have to make it so that the bosses looked unique, make them look special, make them actually special, and play differently than everyday enemies that you fight just casually throughout the game. The Division, though, isn't just a third-person shooter. It also has a looter element, and the problem with that is that the loot isn't that desirable. I think a lot of the guns are very similar to one another, especially amongst their own class. I never really had an urge to use a certain type of assault rifle. I would just pick the assault rifle with the most damage, and I found this to be a pretty simple way to play the game. There was no weapon that I looked at or saw someone have and was like, man, I really wish I had this weapon. They all look so similar, they all play so similarly, that really they're just not that desirable. The armor in the game, while it does upgrade your character, really doesn't add that much in terms of abilities. Nothing adds that much in terms of abilities. It just adds like stat increases, and that's a really boring way to make a looter. Make it so that the game should have it so that you get abilities as you get more equipment and get better abilities or different abilities, so then you actually have a choice rather than just looking at a number and being like, this number is so blatantly better than that number, I'm going to use it. These looter problems don't just exist with the weapons and the armor, but they also exist with the attachment. The attachments are literally just like stat increases. You attach a red dot sight to your gun and you get +6 accuracy, or you attach a laser sight and you get +2 hip fire. It's just lame. It's not that fun. It doesn't add anything creative to the game. They easily could have had better attachments, such as like adding a flamethrower to the bottom of your gun or a grenade launcher. They could have added elements to these weapons, and they chose not to. And I think this really makes the guns and just the loot and system in general not very interesting. There's really not that much to do. You just look at the statistical advantages for a weapon and you pick that. There's no like choice over abilities amongst the weapons and the armor that make it so that you want to pick a certain type of loadout, and maybe you sacrifice having less armor to make it so that you have a different range of abilities that you otherwise wouldn't have had. With all that out of the way, I think we need to enter the Dark Zone. And the Dark Zone is probably the Division's most interesting feature. It's basically a PvP where everyone roams around searching for loot, and that's a PvE element where there's enemies guarding it. But whenever you gather loot and while you're wandering the Dark Zone, other players can kill you and take your loot. And I find this to be an interesting concept. The only problem is it doesn't really work. One of the problems with the Dark Zone is the fact that you need to generally run with a squad of 3. Running by yourself around is very dangerous, and it makes it in a situation where you go against a group of 3, you're almost always going to lose. It just makes it very unsafe. It's not optimal. It's probably not a good way to play the game. The game has an in-system matchmaking, which works to get you into a group of 3, but the problem with that is many of these people don't really communicate. They don't really work as a team. They're often just roaming around doing their own thing. And the problem is, if they shoot an agent, you go into rogue status, which makes it so any other agent can shoot at you with no consequence. They're able to kill you without going rogue themselves. And that's a problem, because I would constantly matchmake into a group, and then someone in that group would kill another agent or shoot at another agent and cause myself to go rogue. And this was just an annoying hassle that made it so I didn't want to use the matchmaking system. Only the few times that I had my friends playing the Division with me did I really enjoy the Dark Zone. But when it was by myself, I just didn't want to go into the Dark Zone, because if I ever got into a fight, I would almost always lose because I would go against groups larger than just one. The Dark Zone, though, doesn't just have problems with matchmaking. I think there's just some problems with the design philosophy of this. The problems come in the fact that people can shoot a couple bullets into you without going rogue. And this is a reasonable system in the fact that like 1 or 2 shots by accident, you don't want to go rogue and then have the consequences. But the problem is, I would have people shooting at me just a couple of bullets without going rogue, and then I would retaliate by shooting back at them, and then I would be the one going rogue. And all I was doing was self-defense. The problem is, I often had to wait for them to do enough damage from them to go rogue so that I would not go rogue when I shot them. But this leads to the problem that I have to wait for them to put enough bullets into me, which puts me at a significant disadvantage. And also the problem that they sometimes would shoot me and I would instantly try to shoot back at them, and I would go rogue because they'd stop shooting for just long enough for me to go rogue so that they wouldn't get the consequences of going rogue. And this is why I don't think Dark Zone works as a design philosophy. philosophy. Because if they remove this system that makes it so a couple bullets don't trigger you to go rogue, then people already run in front of you while you're shooting enemy AI so that you're the one that goes rogue. And if they made it even easier for people just to run, take a couple shots and cause you to go rogue, it would make this game very unplayable. It's really a problem where there's not really a happy balance. Either way, you're going to make people unhappy and you're going to make a system that people can abuse. And because of that, I just don't think it's a very fun area to be in. I constantly find people trolling me, either shooting a couple bullets or running in front of my gunfire so that I'm the one that goes rogue, because when you go rogue, you have stricter consequences. You lose more money that you were gathering and more equipment that you had. And because of that, I feel like this system just doesn't work. It probably would have been better if the game just didn't have a dark zone. I don't feel like it was executed that well. And I think that you would have to completely revamp the dark zone to make it playable to everyone and make it so that it's not so exploitable in certain elements of the dark zone. With all these things said about the gameplay, it's going to get a 2 out of 5 when it comes to gameplay. It's just not a very fun game when it comes down to what you can actually do in the game. Next, we move on to story, and I think The Division does a decent job at making a decent story. I think there's not that much in terms of like creativity. I think it's an interesting idea, but I wish it was executed better or executed more and had more deeper elements into it. It wasn't that interesting. I never really cared who caused the virus outbreak. They don't do a great job of making it so that you really care about what's going on in New York. One thing that they do get right is the world building. There's little areas where you can find information about the people that lived in New York before and during the virus outbreak. And I think this is pretty interesting. You get to hear cell phone recordings and stuff, and it makes it so it feels like a place I was once lived in. You learn a little bit about these characters and you can explore around and find out more about their story. And I find this to be a really creative idea, that this is how they build the world. I think they did a pretty good job of just making New York feel a very lived in place. I just wish that the overall story, that is why you're doing your missions, was more fleshed out and more interesting. I feel like that was kind of weak. That's why ultimately the story's going to get a 3 out of 5. I think the world building, they did a pretty decent job, but the story itself is just not that good. Next, we move on to replayability. And this is honestly where it's going to also be pretty bad on the game. It's not that fun. I did not enjoy my time playing it that much. I can see why some people would really enjoy this game. If you like third-person shooters, you might enjoy this game a little bit. If you like looter, you might enjoy this game a little bit. This game has some general ideas and concepts that are interesting. They just don't execute them that well. I feel like the game just isn't that fun. I never really got the urge after I played it for quite a bit of time. I tried to play it again to get some footage for this review, and I really realized I just don't enjoy the game that much. I was happy when I got enough footage, and I feel like that kind of shows this game. I don't feel like there's really that much to replay. I feel like it gets really repetitive really quickly. Playing the missions over and over again just isn't that fun. It's just a constant grind fest. I don't feel like it respects my time. I don't feel like what I earn is worth the amount of time I'm contributing to get it. I just don't feel like this game has very good replayability. And because of that, I'm going to give it a 2 out of 5 in the replayability scale. So when all this is said and done, I think I'm going to look at The Division as an okay game. It's not that good. I would say it's probably on the lower scale. That's why I'm giving it a 5 out of 10. It's an okay game. It does most things all right, but it doesn't do anything great. It's kind of just a mediocre game. I don't advise you to buy this game. I think it's very average in many ways, and I think a little below average in enough ways that make it deserve a 5 out of 10. I think that this game needs some fundamental changes that just aren't going to happen because they can't change it after they've released it like this. And I don't feel like they can really do anything to make it so that I'm going to go back to this game and change my mind. It just doesn't have that much in terms of fun. It doesn't have that much in terms of unique weapons or rewards. I don't feel like the Dark Zone was executed that well, and because of that, I just don't think this is a great game. If you enjoyed my review, feel free to subscribe. If you don't agree, or if you do have something to say about my review, feel free to comment below. I love to hear your guys' opinions. I think that even if you disagree, I want to hear why you think differently. I like to hear your guys' opinions. Also, look me up on Instagram. I have a review account that you guys can see my summary reviews already posted on The Division. Please subscribe, and I hope you enjoyed this clean game review.